Hello, welcome back to Storytime. So this is our Older Ages Storytime, where we are reading the Sherlock Holmes short stories. And I was just looking at how many short stories we have left, because we are getting near the end. And it looks like there are about 3... Oh, hey, Kicken, how are you doing? Thanks for joining me. There are about enough for 3 more Sherlock Holmes story times with the short stories, but there are also the Sherlock Holmes novels, and there are also I also have a whole bunch of other older ages books, such as the Scarlet Pimpernel, which is sort of a medieval, or not medieval, but I don't know, 17th century spy type of story that I've always been intrigued by. The Phantom of the Opera. Oh yes, there are 2 Agatha Christie mysteries. The first of the Poirots, and then there's a standalone, and I'm really intrigued by them as well. And almost all of these books I haven't read before, with the exception of Phantom of the Opera, which I have read, and I love that one. It's very different from the musical and also the movie. But yeah, anyways, a bit of a disclaimer. These are all public domain books that I read, and as such, they are all over 100 years old. So sometimes they will use terminology, or they will make a statement or make an observation that was appropriate back at the time, and it may or may not be appropriate, in current times, and may not coincide with my own personal feelings. But I like to keep them as true to as they were written as possible. So keep that in mind as we're reading. There are exceptions, though. 100 years old. Yeah. The rule for public domain is that it is either 95 years after the publication or 120 years after. I don't remember that part of it. I just go by the rule of a cool 100 years. If it's 100 years old, you're pretty safe. And so like with the Sherlock Holmes, that was very early 1900s. And he will refer to years as well. And Agatha Christie, the first, I think it's the Curious Affair at Styles, was the first one that she ever wrote. And that was exactly 100 years ago this year. So it was in 1920 that it was written. And then the other one, The Man in the Brown Suit, is probably about 97 years old, something like that. But yeah, like sometimes you'll listen to the things that they refer to, and it's very dated. Like, definitely when I was reading The Boxcar Children, they do often talk about, the girls loved to do cooking and sewing, and the boys loved to build things. And it's like, no, I mean, some girls do like to do cooking, but some guys love to do cooking as well. And you know what? There are girls that love building stuff. Like, I totally would have been right there in the river building their swimming pool with them. Plus, I love swimming, so. Anyways, let's go ahead and get started with, right now we're working our way through the short stories from The Return of Sherlock Holmes, because the first oh goodness, I don't even remember how many there were, but there were a ton in the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And then Sir Arthur Conan Doyle took a few years. He was done writing Sherlock Holmes, but I don't remember the circumstances that led to him returning to Sherlock Holmes, and so he had to sort of quick think, how do I explain his return? And so this is after, he also talks about some cases before the Reichenbach Falls mystery, which, it is in one of the YouTube streams, and I do write which adventures in the description I am reading, and I do about 2 adventures per story time because it takes about an hour to read one short story, and I love that about these adventures. It's pretty consistent. That one did go a little bit over because that was a longer one because it was sort of a farewell one. Yeah, exactly. Anyways, let's go ahead and get started with The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton. It is years since the incidents in which I speak took place, and yet it is with diffidence that I allude to them. For a long time, even with the utmost discretion and reticence, it would have been impossible to make the facts public, but now the principal person concerned is beyond the reach of the human law, and with due suppression, the story may be told in such fashion as to injure no one. It records an absolutely unique experience in the career both of Mr. Sherlock Holmes and of myself. The reader will excuse me if I conceal the date of any other fact by which he might trace the actual occurrence. We had been out of for one of our evening rambles, Holmes and I, and had returned about 6 o'clock on a cold, frosty winter's evening. As Holmes turned up the lamp, the light fell upon a card on the table. He glanced at it, and then, with an ejaculation of disgust, threw it on the floor. I picked it up and read, Charles Augustus Milverton, Appledore Towers, Agent, Hampstead. Who is he? I asked. The worst man in London, Holmes answered as he sat down and stretched his legs before the fire. Is anything on the back of the card? I turned it over. Will call at 6:30 c.a.m., I read. He's about due. Do you feel a creeping, seeking sensation, Watson, when you stand before the serpents in the zoo and see the slithering, gliding, venomous creatures with their deadly eyes and wicked, flattened faces? Well, that's how Milverton impresses me. I've had to do with 50 murders in my career, but the worst of them never gave me the repulsion which I have for this fellow. And yet I can't get out of doing business with him. Indeed, he is here at my invitation. But who is he? I'll tell you, Watson. He is the king of all the blackmailers. Heaven help the man, and still more the woman whose secret and reputation come into the power of Milverton. With a smiling face and a heart of marble, he will squeeze and squeeze until he has drained them dry. The fellow is a genius in his way, and would have made his mark in some more savory trade. His method is as follows. He allows it to be known that he is prepared to pay very high sums for letters which compromise people of wealth and position. He receives these wares not only from treacherous valets or maids, but frequently from genteel ruffians who have gained the confidence and affection of trusting women. He deals with no thrifting hand. It was a word that I didn't want to use, so apologies. I happen to know that he paid £700 to a footman for a note 2 lines in length, and that the ruin of the noble family was the result. Everything which is in the market goes to Milverton, and there are hundreds in this city who turn white at his name. No one knows where his grip may fall, for he is far too rich and far too cunning to work from hand to mouth. He will hold a card back for years in order to play it at the moment when the stake is best worth winning. I have said that he is the worst man in London, and I would ask you, how could one compare the ruffian who in hot blood bludgeons his mate with this man, who methodically and at his leisure tortures the souls and wrings the nerves in order to add to his already swollen money bag? I had seldom heard my friend speak with such intensity and feeling. But surely, said I, the fellow must be within the grasp of the law. Technically, no doubt, but practically not. What would it profit a woman, for example, to get him a few months' imprisonment if her own ruin must immediately follow? His victims dare not hit back. If ever he blackmailed an innocent person, then, indeed, we should have him. But he is as cunning as the evil one. No, we must find other ways to fight him. And why is he here? Because an illustrious client has placed her piteous case in my hands. It is the Lady Eva Brackwell, the most beautiful debutante of last season. She is to be married in a fortnight to the Earl of Dovercourt. This fiend has several imprudent letters. Imprudent, Watson, nothing worse, which were written to an impecunious, oh goodness, this is a word, impecunious young squire in the country. They would suffice to break off the match. Milverton will send the letters to the Earl unless a large sum of money is paid him. I have been commissioned to meet him and to make the best terms I can. At that instant there was a clatter and a rattle in the street below. Looking down, I saw a stately carriage and pair, the brilliant lamps gleaming on the glossy haunches of the noble chestnuts. A footman opened the door, and a small, stout man in a shaggy astrakhan overcoat descended. A minute later he was in the room. Charles Augustus Milverton was a man of 50, with a large, intellectual head, a round, plump, hairless face, a perpetual frozen smile, and two keen gray eyes which gleamed brightly from beneath broad, golden-rimmed glasses. There was something of Mr. Pickwick's benevolence in his appearance, marred only by the insincerity of the fixed smile and by the hard glitter of those restless and penetrating eyes. His voice was as smooth and suave as his countenance, as he advanced with a plump little hand extended, murmuring his regret for having missed us at his first visit. Holmes disregarded the outstretched hand and looked at him with a face of granite. Milverton's broad smile broadened. He shrugged his shoulders, removed his overcoat, folded it with great deliberation over the back of a chair, and then took a seat. "This gentleman," said he, with a wave in my direction, "is it discreet? Is it right? Dr. Watson is my friend and partner." "Very good, Mr. Holmes. It is only in your client's interest that I protested. The matter is so very delicate." "Dr. Watson has already heard of it." "Then we can proceed to business. You say that you are acting for Lady Eva. Has she empowered you to accept my terms?" "What are your terms?" £7,000. "And the alternative?" "My dear, it is painful to me to discuss it, but if the money is not paid on the 14th, there certainly will be no marriage on the 18th. His insufferable smile was more complacent than ever. Holmes thought for a little. "You appear to me," he said at last, "to be taking matters too much for granted. I am, of course, familiar with the contents of these letters. My client will certainly do what I advise." "Hi, Reaper, how are you doing?" I have to find my place. Sorry about that. "My client will certainly do what I may advise. I shall counsel her to tell her future husband the whole story, and to trust to his generosity." Milverton chuckled. "You evidently do not know the Earl," said he. From the baffled look upon Holmes' face, I could clearly see that he did. "What harm is there in the letters?" he asked. "They were sprightly, very sprightly," Milverton answered. "The lady was a charming correspondent, but I can assure you that the Earl of Dovercourt would fail to appreciate them. However, since you think otherwise, you will let it rest at that. It is purely a matter of business. If you think that it is in the best interest of your client that these letters should be placed in the hands of the Earl, then you would indeed be foolish to pay so large a sum of money to regain them. He rose and seized his astrakhan coat. I am doing all right. Oh, thank you so much for the host, Reaper. I've got a very annoying cat in my lap, but she's enjoying the story. This Snockings is in my lap right now. She's the gray tabby. Holmes was gray with anger and mortification. Wait a little, he said. You go too fast. You would certainly make every effort to avoid scandal in so delicate a matter. Milverton relapsed into his chair. I was sure that you would see it in that light, he purred. At the same time, Holmes continued, Lady Eva is not a wealthy woman. I assure you that £2,000 would be a drain upon her resources, and that the sum you name is utterly beyond her power. I beg, therefore, that you will moderate your demands, and that you will return the letters at the price I indicate, which is, I assure you, the highest that you can get. Milverton's smile broadened, and his eyes twinkled humorously. I am aware that what you say is true about the lady's resources, said he. At the same time, you must admit that the occasion of a lady's marriage is a very suitable time for her friends and relatives to make some little effort upon her behalf. They may hesitate as to an acceptable wedding present. Let me assure you that this little bundle of letters would give more joy than all the candelabra and butter dishes in London. Oh, thank you so much. I'm so glad. And of course, I am, just to give you a little bit of a warning that content-wise, it doesn't look like this one is a bad one, but sometimes things do get a little bit intense in the Sherlock Holmes stories. But it doesn't look like they allude to his drug problem, so I am glad about that. Let's see. Yes, here we are. It is impossible, said Holmes. Dear me, how unfortunate, cried Milverton, taking out a bulky pocket-book. I cannot help thinking that ladies are ill-advised in not making an effort. Look at this. He held up a little note with a coat of arms upon the envelope. That belongs to you. Well, perhaps it is hardly fair to tell the name until tomorrow morning, but at that time it will be in the hands of the lady's husband, and all because she will not find a beggarly sum which she could get in an hour by turning her diamonds into paste. It is such a pity. Now you remember the sudden end of the engagement between the Honourable Miss Miles and Colonel Dorking. Only 2 days before the wedding there was a paragraph in the Morning Post to say that it was off. And why? It is most incredible, but the absurd sum of £1,200 would have settled the whole question. Is it not painful? And here I find you a man of sense, boggling about terms when your client's future and honour are at stake. You surprise me, Mr. Holmes. What I say is true, Holmes answered. The money cannot be found. Surely it is better for you to take the substantial sum which I offer than to ruin this woman's career, which can profit you in no way. There you make a mistake, Mr. Holmes. An exposure would profit me indirectly to a considerable extent. I have 8 or 10 similar cases maturing. It is, if it was circulated among them that I had made a severe example of the Lady Eva, I should find all of them much more open to reason. You see my point? Holmes sprang from his chair. Get behind him, Watson. Don't let him out. Now, sir, let us see the contents of that notebook. Milverton had glided as quick as a rat to the side of the room and stood with his back against the wall. Mr. Holmes, he said, turning the front of his coat and exhibiting the butt of the large revolver, which projected from the inside pocket. I have been expecting you to do something original. This has been done so often, and what good has ever come from it? I assure you that I am armed to the teeth, and I am perfectly prepared to use my weapon, knowing that the law will support me. Besides, your supposition that I would bring the letters here in a notebook is entirely mistaken. I would do nothing so foolish. And now, gentlemen, I have one or two little interviews this evening, and it is a long drive to Hampstead. He stepped forward, took up his coat, laid his hand on his revolver, and turned to the door. I picked up a chair, but Holmes shook his head, and I laid it down again. With a bow, a smile, and a twinkle, Milverton was out of the room, and a few moments after, we heard the slam of the carriage door and the rattle of the wheels as he drove away. Holmes sat motionless by the fire, his hands buried deep in his trouser pockets, his chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes fixed upon the glowing embers. For half an hour he was silent and still. Then, the gesture of a man who has taken his decision, he sprang to his feet and passed into his bedroom. A little later, a rakish young workman with a goatee beard and a swagger lit his clay pipe at the lamp before descending into the street. "I'll be back some time, Watson," said he, and vanished into the night. I understood that he had opened his campaign against Charles Augustus Milverton, but I little dreamed the strange shape which that campaign was destined to make. For some days Holmes came and went at all hours in this attire, but beyond a remark that this time was spent at Hampstead, and that it was not wasted, I knew nothing of what he was doing. At last, however, on a wild, tempestuous evening, when the wind screamed and rattled against the windows, he returned from his last expedition, and having removed his disguise, he sat before the fire and laughed heartily in his silent inward fashion. "You would not call me a marrying man, Watson?" "No, indeed." "You'll be interested to hear that I am engaged." "My dear fellow, I congratulate Milverton's housemaid." "Good heavens, Holmes!" "I wanted information, Watson." "Surely you have gone too far." "It was a most necessary step. I am a plumber with a rising business, Escott by name. I have walked out with her each evening, and I have talked with her. Good heavens, those talks! However, I've got all I wanted. I know Milverton's house as I know the palm of my hand." "But the girl, Holmes!" He shrugged his shoulders. "You can't help it, my dear Watson. You must play your cards as best you can when such a stake is on the table. However, I rejoice to say that I have a hated rival who will certainly cut me out the instant that my back is turned. What a splendid night it is!" "You like this weather?" "It suits my purpose. Watson, I mean to burgle Milverton's house tonight." I had a catching of the breath, and my skin went cold at the words, which were slowly uttered in a tone of concentrated resolution. As a flash of lightning in the night showed up in an instant every detail of a wide landscape, so at one glance I seemed to see every possible result of such an action. The detection, the capture, the honored career ending in irreparable failure and disgrace, my friend himself lying at the mercy of the odious Milverton. "For heaven's sake, Holmes, think what you are doing!" I cried. "My dear Watson, I have given it every consideration. I am never precipitate in my actions, nor could I adopt so energetic and indeed so dangerous a course if any other were possible. Let us look in the matter clearly and fairly. I suppose that you will admit that the action is morally justifiable, though technically criminal. To burgle this house is no more than to forcibly take his pocket-book, an action in which you were prepared to aid me." I turned it over in my mind. Yes, I said, it is morally justifiable so long as our object is to take no article save those which are used as for an illegal purpose. Exactly. Since it is morally justifiable, I have only to consider the question of personal risk. Surely a gentleman should not lay much stress upon this when a lady is in most desperate need of his help. You will be in such a false position. Well, that is part of the risk. There is no other possible way of regaining these letters. The unfortunate lady has not the money, and there are none of our people in whom she could confide. Tomorrow is the last day of grace, and unless we can get the letters tonight, this villain will be as good as his word, and will bring about her ruin. I must, therefore, abandon my client to her fate, or I must play this last card. Between ourselves, Watson, it is a sporting duel between this fellow Milverton and me. He had, as you saw, the best of the first exchanges, but my self-respect and my reputation are concerned to fight it to the finish. Well, I don't like it, but I suppose it must be, said I. When do we start? You are not coming. Then you are not going, said I. I give you my word of honor, and I never broke it in my life, that I will take a cab straight to the police station and give you away unless you let me share this adventure with you. You can't help me. How do you know that? You can't tell what may happen. Anyway, my resolution is taken. Other people beside you have self-respect and even reputations. Holmes had looked annoyed, but his brow cleared, and he clapped me in the shoulders. Well, well, my dear fellow, be it so. We have shared the same room for some years, and it would be amusing if we ended by sharing the same cell. You know, Watson, I don't mind confessing to you that I have always had an idea that I would have made a highly efficient criminal. This is the chance of my lifetime in that direction. See here. He took a neat little leather case out of a drawer and opened it as he exhibited a number of shining instruments. This is a first-class, up-to-date burgling kit with nickel-plated jemmy, diamond-tipped glass cutter, adaptable keys, and every modern improvement with the march of civilization demands. Here, too, is my dark lantern. Everything is in order. Have you a pair of silent shoes? I have rubber-soled tennis shoes. Excellent. And a mask. I can make a couple out of black silk. I can see that you have a strong natural turn for this sort of thing. Very good. Do you make the masks? You shall have some cold supper before we start. It is now 9:30. At 11 we shall drive as far as Church Row. It is a quarter of an hour's walk from here to Appledore Towers. We shall be at work before midnight. Milverton is a heavy sleeper and retires punctually at 10:30. With any luck, we should be back here by 2, with the Lady Eva's letters in my pocket. Holmes and I put on our dress clothes so that we might appear to be two theatre-goers homeward bound. In Oxford Street we picked up a hansom and drove to an address in Hampstead. Here we paid off our cab, and with our greatcoats buttoned up, for it was bitterly cold and the wind seemed to blow through us, we walked along the edges of the heath. It's a business that needs delicate treatment, said Holmes. These documents are contained in a safe in the fellow's study, and the study is in the anteroom of his bedchamber. On the other hand, like all these stout little men who do themselves well, he is a plethoric sleeper. Agatha, that's my fiancée, says it is a joke in the servants' hall that it is impossible to wake the master. He has a secretary who is devoted to his interests and never budges from the study all day. That's why we are going at night. Then he has a beast of a dog which roams the garden. I met Agatha late the last 2 evenings, and she locked the brood up so as to give me a clear run. This is the house, this big one, in its own grounds. Through the gate, now to the right among the laurels. We might put on our masks here, I think. You see, there is not a glimmer of light in any of the windows, and everything is working splendidly. With our black silk face coverings, which turned us into two of the most truculent figures in London, we stole up to the silent, gloomy house. A sort of tiled veranda extended along one side of it, lined by several windows and 2 doors. "That is the bedroom," Holmes whispered. "This door opens straight into the study. It would suit us best, but it is bolted as well as locked, and we should make too much noise getting in. Come round here. There's a greenhouse which opens into the drawing room." The place was locked, but Holmes removed a circle of glass and turned the key from the inside. An instant afterward he had closed the door behind us, and we had become felons in the eyes of the law. The thick, warm air of the conservatory and the rich, choking fragrance of exotic plants took us by the throat. He seized my hand in the darkness and led me swiftly past banks of shrubs which brushed against our faces. Holmes had remarkable powers, carefully cultivated by seeing in the dark. Still, holding my hand in one of his, he opened a door, and I was vaguely conscious that we had entered a large room in which a cigar had been smoked not long before. He felt his way among the furniture, opened another door, and closed it behind us. Putting out my hand, I felt several coats hanging from the walls, and I understood that I was in a passage. We passed along it, and Holmes very gently opened a door upon the right-hand side. Something rushed out at us, and my heart sprang into my mouth, but I could have laughed when I realized that it was the cat. A fire was burning in this new room, and again the air was heavy with tobacco smoke. Holmes entered on tiptoe, waiting for me to follow, and then very gently closed the door. We were in Milverton's study, and a portiere at the farther end showed the entrance to his bedroom. It was a good fire, and the room was illuminated by it. Near the door I saw the gleam of an electric switch, but it was unnecessary, even if it had been safe to turn it on. At one side of the fireplace was a heavy curtain which covered the bay window, and we had seen from outside. On the other side was the door which communicated with the veranda. A desk stood in the center with a turning chair of silver-red leather. Opposite was a large bookcase with a marble bust of Athena on the top. In the corner between the bookcase and the wall there stood a tall green safe, the firelight flashing back from the polished brass knobs upon its face. Holmes stole across and looked at it. Then he crept to the door of the bedroom and stood with slanting head listening intently. No sound came from within. Meanwhile, it had struck me that it would be wise to secure our retreat through the outer door, so I examined it. To my amazement, it was neither locked nor bolted. I touched Holmes on the arm, and he turned his masked face in that direction. I saw him start, and he was evidently as surprised as I. "I don't like it," he whispered, putting his lips to my very ear. "I can't quite make it out. Anyhow, we have no time to lose." "Can I do anything?" "Yes, stand by the door. If you hear anyone come, bolt it on the inside, and we can get away as we came. If they come the other way, we can get through the door if our job is done, or hide behind these window curtains if it is not. Do you understand?" I nodded and stood by the door. My first feeling of fear had passed away, and I thrilled now with a keener zest than I had ever enjoyed when we were in the defenders of the law instead of its defiers. The high object of our mission, the consciousness that it was unselfish and chivalrous, the villainous character of our opponent, all added to the sporting interest of the adventure. Far from feeling guilty, I rejoiced and exulted in our danger. With a glow of admiration, I watched Holmes unrolling his case of instruments and choosing his tools with the calm, scientific accuracy of a surgeon who performs a delicate operation. I knew that the opening of safes was a particular hobby of him, and I understood the joy which it gave him. to be confronted with this green and gold monster, the dragon which held in its maw the reputations of many fair ladies. Turning up the cuffs of his dress coat, he had placed his overcoat on a chair. Holmes laid out 2 drills, a jemmy, and several skeleton keys. I stood at the center door with my eyes glancing at each of the others, ready for any emergency, though indeed my plans were somewhat vague as to what I should do if we were interrupted. For half an hour Holmes worked with concentrated energy, lying down one tool, picking up another, handling each with the strength and delicacy of a trained mechanic. Finally I heard a click. The broad green door swung open, and inside I had a glimpse of a number of paper packets, each tied, sealed, and inscribed. Holmes picked one out, but it was hard to read by the flickering fire, and he drew out his little dark lantern, for it was too dangerous, with Milverton in the next room, to switch on the electric light. Suddenly I saw him halt, listen intently, and then, in an instant, he had swung the door of the safe to, picked up his coat, stuffed his tools into the pocket, and darted behind the window curtains, motioning me to do the same. It was only when I had joined him there that I heard what had alarmed his quicker senses. There was a noise somewhere within the house. A door slammed in the distance. Then a confused, dull murmur broke itself into the measured thud of heavy footsteps rapidly approaching. They were in the passage outside the room. They paused at the door. The door opened. There was a sharp snick as the electric light was turned on. The door closed once more, and the pungent reek of a strong cigar was borne to our nostrils. Then the footsteps continued backwards and forwards, within a few yards of us. Finally, there was a creak from a chair, and the footsteps ceased. Then a key clicked in the lock, and I heard the rustle of papers. So far I had not dared to look out, but now I gently parted the division of the curtains in front of me and peeped through. From the pressure of Holmes' shoulders against mine, I knew that he was sharing my observations. Right in front of us, and almost within our reach, was the broad, rounded back of Milverton. It was evident that we had entirely miscalculated his movements, that he had never been to his bedroom, but that he had been sitting up in some smoking or billiard room in the further wing of the house, the windows of which we had not seen. His broad, grizzled head, with its shining patch of baldness, was in the immediate foreground of our vision. He was leaning far back in the red leather chair, his legs outstretched, a long black cigar projecting at an angle from his mouth. He wore a semi-military smoking jacket, claret-colored, with a black velvet collar. In this hand he held a long legal document, which he was reading in an indolent fashion, blowing rings of tobacco smoke from his lips as he did so. There was no promise of a speedy departure in his composed bearing and his comfortable attitude. Sorry, just took a moment to drink. I felt Holmes' hand steal into mine and give me a reassuring shake, as if to say that the situation was within his powers, and that he was easy in his mind. I was not sure whether he had seen what was only too obvious from my position, that the door of the safe was imperfectly closed, and that Milverton might at any moment observe it. In my own mind, I determined that if I were sure from the rigidity of his gaze that it had caught his eye, I would at once bring out, throw my greatcoat over his head, pinion him, and leave the rest to Holmes. But Milverton never looked up. He was languidly interested by the papers in his hand, and page after page was turned as he followed the argument of the lawyer. At last, I thought, when he finished the document and the cigar, he would go to his room. But before he had reached the end of either, there came a remarkable development which turned our thoughts into quite another channel. Several times I had observed that Milverton looked at his watch, and once he had risen and sat down again with a gesture of impatience. The idea, however, that he might have an appointment at so strange an hour never occurred to me until a faint sound reached my ear from the veranda outside. Milverton dropped his papers and sat rigid in his chair. The sound was repeated, and then there came a gentle tap at the door. Milverton rose and opened it. "Well," said he curtly, "you are nearly half an hour late." So this was the explanation of the unlocked door and the nocturnal vigil of Milverton. There was the gentle rustle of a woman's dress. I had crossed the slit between the curtains as Milverton's face had turned in our direction, but now I ventured very carefully to open it once more. He had resumed his seat, the cigar still projecting at an insolent angle from the corner of his mouth. In front of him, in the full glare of the electric light, there stood a tall, slim, dark woman, a veil over her face, a mantle drawn round her chin. Her breath came quick and fast, and every inch of the lithe figure was quivering with strong emotion. "Well," said Milverton, "you've made me lose a good night's rest, my dear. I hope you'll prove worth it. You couldn't come any other time, eh?" The woman shook her head. "Well, if you couldn't, you couldn't. If the Countess is a hard mistress, you have your chance to get level with her now. Bless the girl, what are you shivering about? That's right, pull yourself together. Now, let us get down to business." He took a note from the drawer of the desk. "You say that you have 5 letters which compromise the Countess d'Albert. You want to sell them. I want to buy them. So far, so good. It only remains to fix the price. I should want to inspect the letters, of course, if they are really good specimens. Great heavens, is it you?" The woman, without a word, had raised her veil and dropped the mantle from her chin. It was a dark, handsome, clear-cut face which confronted Milverton, a face with a curved nose, strong, dark eyebrows shading hard, glittering eyes, and a straight, thin-lipped mouth set in a dangerous smile. "It is I," she said, "the woman whose life you have ruined." Milverton laughed, but fear vibrated in his voice. "You were so very obstinate," said he. "Why did you drive me to such extremities? I assure you I wouldn't hurt a fly of my own accord, but every man has his business, and what was I to do? I put the price well within your means. You would not pay. So you sent the letters to my husband, and he, the noblest gentleman that ever lived, a man whose boots I was never worthy to lace, he broke his gallant heart and died. You remember that last night when I came through that door, I begged and prayed you for mercy, and you laughed in my face as you were trying to laugh now, only your coward heart cannot keep your lips from twitching. Yes, you never thought to see me here again, but it was that night which taught me how I could meet you face to face, and alone. Well, Charles Milverton, what have you to say?" "Don't imagine that you can bully me," said he, rising to his feet. "I have only to raise my voice, and I could call my servants, and have you arrested, but I will make allowance for your natural anger. Leave the room at once as you came, and I will say no more." The woman stood with her hand buried in her bosom, and the same deadly smile on her lips. "You will ruin no more lives as you have ruined mine. You will wring no more hearts as you have wrung mine. I will free the world of that poisonous thing. Take that, you hound, and that, and that, and that!" She had drawn a little gleaming revolver and emptied barrel after barrel into Milverton's body, the muzzle within 2 feet of his shirt front. He shrank away and then fell forward upon the table, coughing furiously and clawing among the papers. Then he staggered to his feet, received another shot, and rolled upon the floor. "You've done me!" he cried, and lay still. The woman looked at him intently and ground her heel into his upturned face. She looked again, but there was no sound or movement. I heard a sharp rustle, and the night air blew into the heated room, and the Avenger was gone. No interference upon our part could have saved the man from his fate, but as the woman poured bullet after bullet into Milverton's shrinking body, I was about to spring out when I felt Holmes' cold, strong grasp upon my wrist. I understood the whole argument of that firm, restraining grip, that it was no affair of ours, that justice had overtaken a villain, that we had our own duties and our own objects, which were not to be lost sight of. But hardly had the woman rushed from the room when Holmes with swift, silent steps was over at the other door. He turned the key in the lock. At the same instant we heard the voices of the house and the sound of hurrying feet. The revolver shots had roused the household. With perfect coolness, Holmes slipped across to the safe, filled his two arms with bundles of letters, and poured them all into the fire. Again and again he did it, until the safe was empty. Someone turned the handle and beat upon the outside of the door. Holmes looked swiftly round. The letter, which had been the messenger of death for Milverton, lay all mottled with his blood upon the table. Holmes tossed it in among the blazing papers. Then he drew the key from the outer door, passed through after me, and locked it on the outside. "This way, Watson," said he. "We can scale the garden wall in this direction." I could not have believed that an alarm could have spread so swiftly. Looking back, the huge house was one blaze of light. The front door was open and figures were rushing down the drive. The whole garden was alive with people, and one fellow raised a view-halloo as we emerged from the veranda and followed hard at our heels. Holmes seemed to know the ground perfectly, and he threaded his way swiftly among the plantation of small trees, I close at his heels, and our foremost pursuer panting after us. It was a 6-foot wall which barred our path, but he sprang to the top and over. As I did the same, I felt the hand of the man behind me grab at my ankle, but I kicked myself free and scrambled over a glass-strewn coping. I fell upon my face among some bushes, but Holmes had me on my feet in an instant, and together we dashed away across the huge expanse of Hampstead Heath. We had run 2 miles, I suppose, before Holmes at last halted and listened intently. All was absolute silence behind us. We had shaken off our pursuers, and were safe. We had breakfasted and were smoking our morning pipe on the day after the remarkable experience which I have recorded, when Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard, very solemn and impressive, was ushered into our modest sitting-room. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," said he. "Good morning. May I ask if you are very busy right now?" "Not too busy to listen to you." "I thought that perhaps if you had nothing particular on hand, you might care to assist us in a most remarkable case which occurred only last night at Hampstead." "Dear me," said Holmes. "What was that?" "A murder. A most dramatic and remarkable murder. I know how keen you are upon these things, and I would stake it as a great favor if you would step down to Appledore Towers and give us the benefit of your advice. It is no ordinary crime. We have had our eyes upon this Mr. Milverton for some time, and between ourselves, he was a bit of a villain. He is known to have held papers which he used for blackmailing purposes. These papers have all been burned by the murderers. No article of value was taken, as it is probable that the criminals were men of good position, whose sole object was to prevent social exposure." "Criminals?" said Holmes. "Plural?" "Yes, there were 2 men. They were, as nearly as possible, captured red-handed. We have their footmarks. We have their description. It's 10 to 1 that we trace them. The first fellow was a bit too active, but the second was caught by the under-gardener, and only got away after a struggle. He was a middle-sized, strongly built man, square jaw, thick neck, a mustache, a mask over his eyes." "That's rather vague," said Sherlock Holmes. Why, it might be a description of Watson." "It's true," said the inspector, with much amusement. "It might be a description of Watson." "Well, I'm afraid I can't help you, Lestrade," said Holmes. "The fact is that I knew this fellow Milverton, that I considered him one of the most dangerous men in London, and that I think there are certain crimes which the law cannot touch, and which, therefore, to some extent, justify private revenge. No, it's no use arguing. I have made up my mind. My sympathies are with the criminals rather than with the victim, and I will not handle this case." "Okay, have a good AFK, Kicken." Holmes had not said one word to me about the tragedy which we had witnessed, but I observed all the morning that he was in his most thoughtful mood, and he gave me the impression, from his vacant eyes and his abstracted manner, of a man who was striving to recall something to his memory. We were in the middle of our lunch when he suddenly sprang to his feet. "By Jove, Watson, I've got it!" he cried. "Take your hat, come with me." He hurried at his top speed down Baker Street and along Oxford Street until we had almost reached Regent Circus. Here on the left hand there stands a shop window, filled with photographs of the celebrities and beauties of the day. Holmes' eyes fixed themselves upon one of them, and following his gaze, I saw the picture of a regal and stately lady in court dress, with a high diamond tiara upon her noble head. I looked at that delicately curved nose, at the marked eyebrows, at the straight mouth and the strong little chin beneath it. Then I caught my breath as I read the time-honored title of the great nobleman and statesman whose wife she had been. My eyes met those of Holmes, and he put his finger to his lips as we turned away from the window. Oh, okay, I gotcha. I've actually reached the end of the first story, so I can take a little break and chat. That took a rather violent turn. Sometimes they do these stories. There has been quite a lot of violence in a few, so that's why I give the age warning about Sherlock Holmes. But I'm about to start on Tuesday a new all ages story, which is going to be not Journey to the Center of the Earth. It was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which I think I saw the old Disney movie a long time ago, but I've never read the book, and I'm intrigued to, because Jules Verne was actually what made steampunk so popular. He was kind of the father of steampunk. If you look up pictures of like the Jules Verne time machine, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and of course 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, they're very stylized. So I've always wanted to read him. I had also thought of doing H.G. Wells, but he seems a bit more intense, but I'll have to look into him because he has some interesting ones as well. Just taking a little drink, refreshing the voice. Oh, Planet Coaster. Is Planet Coaster the one where you design your own theme park and roller coasters and stuff like that? Oh, nice. What genre are you planning on writing? I should do a little picture to switch to and have it just say "just chatting" or something like that. Taking a little bit of a stretch here. Should we continue with the next and last story of the stream? It is The Adventure of the Six Napoleons. Okay. Oh, nice. Yeah, I know. I remember you were talking about starting a D&D campaign and that you were going to be doing live streaming of that. So that'll be fun to watch. Ooh, action horror adventure. That sounds cool. I do love a good horror, but I'm picky about my horror. Like, I love the supernatural slant to it. Not so much for the gore, personally. But a really good, intriguing one is really fun. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and continue with story time and start the next adventure. And this will, of course, be another hour-long story. It is adventure number 8 of The Return of Sherlock Holmes, The Adventure of the 6 Napoleons. It was no unusual thing for Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard to look in upon us on an evening, and his visits were welcomed by Sherlock Holmes, for they enabled him to keep in touch with all that was going on in the police headquarters. In return for the news which Lestrade would bring, Holmes was always ready to listen with attention to the details of any case upon which the detective was engaged, and was able occasionally, without any active interference, to give some hint or suggestion drawn from his own vast knowledge and experience. On this particular evening, Lestrade had spoken of the weather in the newspapers. Then he had fallen silent, puffing thoughtfully at his cigar. Holmes looked keenly at him. Ooh, nice. Let me know how it turns out. Anything remarkable on hand? He asked. Oh, no, Mr. Holmes, nothing very particular. Then tell me about it. Lestrade laughed. Well, Mr. Holmes, there is no use denying that there is something on my mind, and yet it is such an absurd business that I hesitate to bother you about it. On the other hand, though it is trivial, it is undoubtedly queer, and I know that you have a taste for all that is out of the common. But in my opinion, it comes more in Dr. Watson's line than yours. Disease? Said I. Madness, anyhow, and a queer madness, too. You wouldn't think that there was anyone living at this time of day who had such a hatred of Napoleon I that he would break any image of him that he could see. Holmes sank back in his chair. That's no business of mine, said he. Exactly, that's what I said. But then when the man commits burglary in order to break images which are not his own, that brings it away from the doctor and on to the policeman. Just taking a little quick read. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll have to figure out the times. I may be able to catch some of it. That's no business of mine, said he. Exactly, that's what I said. But then when the man commits burglary in order to break images which are not his own, that brings it away from the doctor and on to the policeman. Holmes sat up again. Burglary? This is more interesting. Let me hear the details. Lestrade took out his official notebook and refreshed his memory from its pages. The first case reported was 4 days ago, said he. It was at the shop of Morse Hudson, who has a place for the sale of pictures and statues in the Kennington Road. The assistant had left the front shop for an instant when he heard a crash, and hurrying in he found a plaster bust of Napoleon, which stood with several other works of art upon the counter, lying shivering into fragments. He rushed out into the road, but although several passers-by declared that they had noticed a man run out of the shop, he could neither see nor could he find any means of identifying the rascal. I am on Pacific time, so that's the one that I'm most familiar with. It seems to me that one of those senseless acts of hooliganism, which occur from time to time, and it was reported to the constable on the beat as such, the plaster cast was not worth more than a few shillings, and the whole affair appeared to be too childish for any particular investigation. The second case, however, was more serious and also more singular. It occurred only last night. In Kennington Road, and within a few hundred yards of Morse Hudson's shop, there lived a well-known medical practitioner, Dr. Barnicot, who has one of the largest practices upon the south side of the Thames. His residence and principal consulting room is at Kennington Road, but he has a branch surgery and a dispensary at Lower Brixton Road, 2 miles away. This Dr. Barnicot is an enthusiastic admirer of Napoleon, and his house is full of books, pictures, and relics of the French Emperor. Some little time ago he purchased from Morse Hudson 2 duplicate plaster casts of the famous head of Napoleon by the French sculptor Devine. One of those he placed in his hall in the house at Kennington Road, and the other on the mantelpiece in the surgery at Lower Brixton. Well, when Dr. Barnicot came down this morning, he was astonished to find that his house had been burgled during the night, but that nothing had been taken save the plaster head from the hall. It had been carried out and had been dashed savagely against the garden wall, under which its splintered fragments were discovered. Holmes rubbed his hands. "This is certainly very novel," said he. "I thought it would please you, but I have not got to the end yet. Dr. Barnicot was due at his surgery at 12 o'clock, and you can imagine his amazement when, on the arriving there, he found that the window had been opened in the night, and that the broken pieces of his second bust were strewn all over the room. It had been smashed to atoms where it stood. In neither case were there any signs which could give us a clue as to the criminal or lunatic who had done the mischief. Now, Mr. Holmes, you have got the facts. They are singular, not to say grotesque," said Holmes. "May I ask whether the 2 busts smashed in Dr. Barnicot's rooms were the exact duplicates of the ones which was destroyed in Morse Hudson's shop?" "They were taken from the same mold." "Oh, by the way, before I continue, go ahead and post up your links to, and let us know about when you're streaming those on the Discord and the self-promo part of it. That's why it's there." "They were taken from the same mold. Such a fact must tell against the theory that the man who breaks them is influenced by any general hatred of Napoleon. Considering how many hundreds of statues of the great emperor must exist in London, it is too much of to suppose such a coincidence as that a promiscuous iconoclast should chance to begin upon 3 specimens of the same bust." "Well, I thought as you do," said Lestrade. "On the other hand, this Morse Hudson is the purveyor of busts in that part of London, and these 3 were the only ones which had been in his shop for years. So, although, as you say, there were many hundreds of statues in London, it is very probable that these were the only ones in that district. Therefore, a local fanatic would begin with them. What do you think, Dr. Watson?" "There are no limits to the possibilities of monomania," I answered. "There is the condition which the modern French philosophists have called the idée fixe, which may be trifling in character, and accompanied by complete sanity in every other way. A man who had read deeply about Napoleon, or who had possibly received some hereditary family injury through the Great War, might conceivably form such an idée fixe, and under its influence be capable of any fantastic outrage." "That will do, my dear Watson," said Holmes, shaking his head. For no amount of idée fixe would enable your interesting monomaniac to find that there were these busts were situated. Well, how do you explain it? I don't attempt to do so. I would only observe that there is a certain method in the gentleman's eccentric proceedings. For example, in Dr. Barnicot's hall, where a sound might arouse the family, the bust was taken outside before being broken, whereas in the surgery, where there was less damage of an alarm, it was smashed where it stood. The affair seems absurdly trifling, and yet I dare call nothing trivial when I reflect that some of my most classic cases have had the least promising commencement. You will remember, Watson, how the dreadful business of the Abernethy family was first brought to my notice by the depths which the parsley had sunk into the butter upon the hot day. You can't afford, therefore, to smile at your 3 broken busts, Lestrade, and I shall be very much obliged to you if you will let me hear any fresh developments of so singular a chain of events. The development of which my friend had asked came in a quicker and an infinitely more tragic form than he could have imagined. I was still dressing in my bedroom next morning when there was a tap at the door, and Holmes entered, a telegram in his hand. He read aloud, "Come instantly, 131 Pitt Street, Kensington, Lestrade." "What is it, then?" I asked. "Don't know. Maybe anything. But I suspect it is the sequel of the story of the statues. In that case, our friend, the image breaker, has begun operations in another quarter of London. There's coffee on the table, Watson, and I have a cab at the door." In half an hour we had reached Pitt Street, and a quiet little backwater just beside one of the briskest currents of London life. Number 131 was one of the low, all flat-chested, respectable, and most unromantic dwellings. As we drove up, we found the railings in front of the house lined by a curious crowd. Holmes whistled. "By George, it's attempted murder at the least. Nothing less will hold the London message boy. There's a deed of violence indicated in that fellow's round shoulders and outstretched neck. What's this, Watson?" "The 2 steps swilled down and the other one's dry. Footsteps enough, anyhow. Well, there's Lestrade at the front window, and we shall soon know all about it." The official received us with a very grave face and showed us into the sitting-room, where an exceedingly unkempt and agitated elderly man, clad in a flannel dressing-gown, was pacing up and down. He was introduced to us as the owner of the house, Mr. Horace Harker, of the Central Press Syndicate. "It's the Napoleon bust business again," said Lestrade. "You seemed interested last night, Mr. Holmes, so I thought perhaps you would be glad to be present now that the affair has taken a very much graver turn." "What has it turned to, then?" "To murder. Mr. Harker will tell you these gentlemen exactly what has occurred. The man in the dressing-gown turned upon us with a most melancholy face. It is an extraordinary thing," said he, "that all my life I have been collecting other people's news, and now that a real piece of news has come my own way, I am so confused and bothered that I can't put 2 words together. If I had come in here as a journalist, I should have interviewed myself and had 2 columns in every evening paper. As it is, I am giving away valuable copy by telling my story over and over again to a string of different people, and I can make no use of it myself. However, I've heard your name, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and if you'll only explain this queer business, I shall be paid for my troubles in telling you the story." Holmes sat down and listened. "It all seems to center round that bust of Napoleon which I bought from this very room about 4 months ago. I picked it up cheap from Harding Brothers, 2 doors from the High Street station.
A great deal of my journalistic work is done at night, and I often write until the early morning. So it was today. I was sitting in my den, which is at the back of the top of the house, about 3 o'clock, when I was convinced that I heard some sounds downstairs. I listened, but they were not repeated, and I concluded that they came from outside. Then suddenly, about 5 minutes later, there came a most horrible yell. The most dreadful sound, Mr. Holmes, that ever I heard. It will ring in my ears as long as I live. I sat frozen with horror for a minute or two. Then I seized the poker and went downstairs. When I entered this room, I found the window wide open, and at once observed that the bust was gone from the mantelpiece. Why any burglar would take such a thing passes my understanding, for it was only a plaster cast and of no real value whatsoever. You can see for yourself that anyone going out through that window would reach the front doorstep by taking a long stride. This was clearly what the burglar had done, so I went round and opened the door. Stepping out into the dark, I nearly fell over a dead man who was lying there. I ran back for a light, and there was the poor fellow, a great gash in his throat, and the whole place swimming with blood. He lay on his back, his knees drawn up, and his mouth horribly open. I shall see him in my dreams. I had just time to blow out my police whistle, and then I must have fainted, for I knew nothing more until I found the policeman standing over me in the hall. Well, who was the murdered man? Said Holmes. There's nothing to show who he was, said Lestrade. We shall see the body at the mortuary, but we have made nothing of it up to now. He is a tall man, sunburned, very powerful, but not more than 30. He is poorly dressed, and yet does not appear to be a laborer. A horn-handled clasp knife was lying in a pool of blood beside him. Whether it was the weapon which did the deed, or whether it belonged to the dead man, I do not know. There was no name on his clothing, and nothing in his pockets save an apple, some string, a shilling map of London, and a photograph. Here it is. I was evidently taken by a head snapshot from a small camera. It represented an alert, short-featured simian man with thick eyebrows and a very peculiar projection of the lower part of his face, like a muzzle or a baboon. And what became of the bust? Asked Holmes, after a careful study of this picture. I know, autocorrect. What became of the bust? Asked Holmes, with careful study of this picture. We had news of it just before you came. It has been found in the front garden of an empty house in Campden House Road. It was broken into fragments. I'm going round now to see it. Will you come? Certainly. I must just take one look round. He examined the carpet and the window. The fellow had neither very long legs, or was a most active man, said he, with an area beneath. It was no mean feat to reach that window ledge, and upon that window. Getting back was comparatively simple. Are you coming with us to see the remains of our bust, Mr. Harker? The disconsolate journalist had seated himself at a writing table. I must try and make something of it, said he, though I have no doubt that the first editions of the new evening paper are out already with full details. It's like my luck. You remember when the stand fell at Doncaster? Well, I was the only journalist in the stand, and my journal, the only one that had no account of it, for I was too shaken to write it. Now I'll be too late with a murder done on my own doorstep. As we left the room, we heard his pen travelling shrilly over the foolscap. The spot where the fragments of the bust had been found was only a few hundred yards away. For the first time our eyes rested upon this predicament of the great emperor, presentment of the great emperor, which seemed to raise such frantic and destructive hatred in the mind of the unknown. It lay scattered in splintered shards upon the grass. Holmes picked up several of them and examined them carefully. I was convinced from his intent face and his purposeful manner that at last he was upon a clue. Well, asked Lestrade. Holmes shrugged his shoulders. "We have a long way to go yet," said he, and yet, well, we have some suggestive facts to act upon. The possession of this trifling bust was worth more in the eyes of this strange criminal than a human life. That is one point. Then there is the singular fact that he did not break it in the house or immediately outside the house, if to break it was the sole object. He was rattled and bustled by meeting this other fellow. He hardly knew what he was doing. Well, that's likely enough, but I wish to call your attention very particularly to the position of this house in the garden of which the bust was destroyed. Lestrade looked about him. It was an empty house, and so he knew that he would not be disturbed in this garden. Yes, but there is another empty house farther up the street, which he must have passed before he came to this one. Why did he not break it there, since it is evident that every yard that he carried it increased the risk of someone meeting him? "I give it up," said Lestrade. Holmes pointed to the street lamp above our heads. He could see what he was doing here, and he could not there. That was his reason. "By Jove, that's true," said the detective. "Now that I come to think of it, Dr. Bannicot's bust was broken not too far from his red lamp. Well, Mr. Holmes, what are we to do with that fact?" "To remember it, to docket it. We may come on something later, which we will bear upon. What steps do you propose to take now, Lestrade?" "The most practical way of getting at it, in my opinion, is to identify the dead man. There should be no difficulty about that. When we have found who he is and who his associates are, we should have a good start in learning what he was doing in Pitt Street that night, and who it was who met him and killed him on the doorstep of Mr. Horace Harker. Don't you think so?" "No doubt. And yet it is not quite the way in which I should approach the case." "What would you do, then?" "Oh, you must not let me influence you in any way. I suggest that you go on your line, and I on mine. We can compare notes afterwards, and each will supplement the other." "Very good," said Lestrade. "If you are going back to Pitt Street, you might see Mr. Horace Harker. Tell him from me that I have quite made up my mind, and that it is certain that a dangerous, homicidal lunatic with Napoleon delusions was in his house last night. It will be useful for his article." Lestrade stared. "You don't seriously believe that?" Holmes smiled. "Don't I? Well, perhaps I don't, but I am sure that it will interest Mr. Horace Harker and the subscribers of the Central Press Syndicate. Now, Watson, I think that we shall find that we have a long and rather complex day's work before us. I should be glad, Lestrade, if you could make it convenient to meet us at Baker Street at 6 o'clock this evening. Until then, I should like to keep this photograph found in the dead man's pocket. It is possible that I may have to ask your company and assistance upon a small expedition which will have to be undertaken tonight, if my chain of reasoning should prove to be correct. Until then, good-bye and good luck." Sherlock Holmes and I walked together to the High Street, where he stopped at the shop of Harding Brothers, whence the bust had been purchased. A young assistant informed us that Mr. Harding would be absent until afternoon, and that he was himself a newcomer who could give us no information. Holmes' face showed his disappointment and annoyance. Well, we can't expect to have all of it our own way, Watson," he said at last. "We must come back in the afternoon if Mr. Harding will not be here until then. I am, as you have no doubt surmised, endeavoring to trace these busts to their source, in order to find if there is not something peculiar which may account for their remarkable fate. Let us make for Mr. Morse Hudson of the Kennington Road. And see if he can throw any light upon the problem." A drive of an hour brought us to the picture-dealing establishment. He was a small, stout man with a red face and peppery manner. "Yes, sir?" "On my very counter, sir," said he. "What we pay rates and taxes for, I don't know, when any ruffian can come in and break one's goods. Yes, sir, it was I who sold Mr. Bannicott his 2 statues. Disgraceful, sir. A nihilist plot, that's what I make it. No one but an anarchist should go about breaking statues. Red Republicans, that's what I call them. Who do I get the statues from? I don't see what that has to do with it. Well, if you really want to know, I got them from Gelder and Company in Church Street, Stepney. They are a well-known house in the trade, and have been this 20 years. How many had I? 3, 2 and 1 are 3, 2 of Dr. Bannicott's and 1 smashed in broad daylight on my own counter. Do I know that photograph? No, I don't. Yes, I do, though. Why, it's Beppo. He was a kind of Italian piecework man who made himself useful in the shop. He could carve a bit and gild the frame and do odd jobs. The fellow left me last week, and I've heard nothing of him since. Now, I don't know where he came from, nor where he went to. I have nothing against him while he was here. He was gone 2 days before the bust was smashed. Well, that's all we could reasonably expect to get from Morse Hudson, said Holmes as we emerged from the shop. We have this Beppo as a common factor, both in Kennington and in Kensington. So that is worth a 10-mile drive. Now, Watson, let us make for Gelder and Company of Stepney, the source and origin of the busts. I shall be surprised if we don't get some help down there. In rapid succession, we passed through the fringe of fashionable London, Hotel London, theatrical London, literary London, commercial London, and finally maritime London, till we came to a riverside city of 100,000 souls, where the tenement houses sweltered and reeked with the outcasts of Europe. Here, in a broad thoroughfare, once the abode of wealthy city merchants, we found the sculpture works for which we searched. Outside was a considerable yard full of monumental masonry. Inside was a large room in which 50 workers were carving or molding. The manager, a big blond German, received us civilly, and gave a clear answer to all Holmes' questions. A reference to his books showed that hundreds of casts had been taken from a marble copy of Divine's head of Napoleon, but that the 3 which had been sent to Morse Hudson a year or so before had been half of a batch of 6, the other 3 being sent to Harding Brothers of Kensington. There was no reason why those 6 should be different to any of the other casts. He could suggest no possible cause why anyone should wish to destroy them. In fact, he laughed at the idea. Their wholesale price was 6 shillings, but the retailer would get 12 or more. The cast was taken in 2 molds from each side of the face, and then these 2 profiles of plaster of Paris were joined together to make the complete bust. The work was usually done by Italians in the room we were in. When finished, the busts were put on a table in a passage to dry and afterwards stored. That was all he could tell us. But the production of the photograph had a remarkable effect upon the manager. His face flushed with anger, and his brows knotted over his blue Teutonic eyes. "Ah, the rascal!" he cried. "Yes, indeed, I know him very well. This has always been a respectable establishment, and the only time that we have ever had the police in it was over this very fellow. It was more than a year ago now. He knifed another Italian in the street, and then he came to the works with the police at his heels, and he was taken here. Beppo was his name. His second name I never knew. Served me right for engaging with a man with such a face. But he was a good workman, one of the best." "What did he get?" "The man lived, and he got off with a year. I have no doubt he is out now, but he has not dared to show his nose here. We have a cousin of his here, and I dare say he could tell you where he is." "Oh, no," cried Holmes, "not a word to the cousin. Not a word, I beg you. The matter is very important, and the farther I go with it, the more important it seems to grow. When you referred to your ledger to the sale of those casts, I observed that the date was June 3rd of last year. Could you give me the date when Beppo was arrested?" "I could tell you roughly by the pay list," the manager answered. "Yes," he continued after turning over the pages. "He was paid last on May 20th. "Thank you," said Holmes. "I don't think I need intrude upon your time and patience any more." With a last word of caution that he should say nothing as to our researches, we turned our faces westward once more. The afternoon was far advanced before we were able to snatch a hasty luncheon at a restaurant. A newsbill of the entrance announced "Kensington outrage, murder by a madman," and the contents of the paper showed that Mr. Horace Harker had got his account into print after all. 2 columns were occupied with a highly sensational and flowery rendering of the whole incident. Holmes propped it against the cruet stand and read it while he ate. Once or twice he chuckled. "This is all right, Watson," said he. "Listen to this. It is satisfactory to know that there can be no difference of opinion upon this case, since Mr. Lestrade, one of the most experienced members of the official force, and Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the well-known consulting expert, have each come to the conclusion that the grotesque series of incidents which have eluded in so tragic a fashion arise from the lunacy rather than from deliberate crime. No explanation save mental aberration can cover the facts. The press, Watson, is a most valuable institution if you only know how to use it. And now, if you have quite finished, we will hark back to Kensington and see that the manager of Harding Brothers has to say to the matter. The founder of that great emporium proved to be a brisk, crisp little person, very dapper and quick, with a clear head and a steady tongue. "Yes, sir, I have already read the account of the evening paper. Mr. Horace Harker is a customer of ours. We supplied him with the bust some months ago. We ordered 3 busts of that sort from Gelder and Company, Stepney. They are all sold now. To whom? Oh, I dare say our consulting our sales book, we could easily tell you. Yes, we have the entries here. 1 to Mr. Harker, you see, and 1 to Mr. Josiah Brown of Laburnum Lodge, Laburnum Vale, Chiswick, and 1 to Mr. Standiford of Lower Grove Road, Reading. No, I never have seen this face which you show me in the photograph. You would hardly forget it, would you, sir? For it's seldom seen, for I've seldom seen an uglier. Have we any Italians on the staff? Yes, sir, we have several among our work people and cleaners. I dare say they might get a peep at that sales book if they wanted to. There's no particular reason for keeping watch upon that book. Well, it's a very strange business, and I hope that you'll let me know if anything comes to you of those inquiries." Holmes had taken several notes during Mr. Harding's evidence, and I could see that he was thoroughly satisfied by the turn which affairs were taking. He made no remark, however, save that, unless we hurried, we should be late for our appointment with Lestrade. Sure enough, when we reached Baker Street, the detective was already there, and we found him pacing up and down in a fever of impatience. His look of importance showed that his day's work had not been in vain. "Well," he asked, "what luck, Mr. Holmes?" "We've had a very busy day, and not entirely a wasted one," my friend explained. "We have seen both the retailers and also the wholesale manufacturers. I can trace each of the busts now from the beginning." "The busts!" cried Lestrade. Well, you have your own methods, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and it is not for me to say a word against them, but I think I've done a better day's work than you. I have identified the dead man." "You don't say so." And found a cause for the crime. Splendid. We have an inspector who makes a specialty of Saffron Hill in the Italian Quarter. Well, this dead man had some Catholic emblem round his neck, and that, along with his color, made me think that he was from the south. Inspector Hill knew him the moment he caught sight of him. His name is Pietro Venucci, from Naples, and he is one of the greatest cutthroats in London. He is connected with the Mafia, which, as you know, is a secret political society, enforcing its decrees by murder. Now you see how the affair begins to clear up. The other fellow is probably an Italian also, and a member of the Mafia. He has broken the rules in some fashion. Pietro is set upon his track. Probably the photograph we found in his pocket is the man himself, so that he may not knife the wrong person. He dogs the fellow, he sees him enter a house, he waits outside for him, and in the scuffle he receives his own death wound. How is that, Mr. Sherlock Holmes? Holmes clapped his hands approvingly. Excellent, Lestrade, excellent, he cried. But I didn't quite follow your explanation of the destruction of the busts. The busts! You never can get those busts out of your mind. After all, that is nothing. Petty larceny, 6 months at the most. It is the murder that we are really investigating. And I tell you that I am gathering all the threads into my hands. And the next stage? It is a very simple one. I shall go down with Hill to the Italian Quarter, find the man whose photograph we have got, and arrest him in the charge of murder. Will you come with us? I think not. I fancy we can attain our end in a simpler way. I can't say for certain, because it all depends. Well, it all depends upon a factor which is completely outside our control, but I have great hopes. In fact, the betting is exactly 2 to 1 that if you will come with us tonight, I shall be able to help you to lay him by the heels. In the Italian Quarter? No. I fancy Chiswick is an address which is more likely to find him. If you will come with me to Chiswick tonight, Lestrade, I'll promise to go to the Italian Quarter with you tomorrow, and no harm will be done by the delay. And now I think that a few hours' sleep would do us all good, for I do not propose to leave before 11 o'clock, and it is unlikely that we shall be back before morning. You'll dine with us, Lestrade, and then you are welcome to the sofa until it is time for us to start. In the meantime, Watson, I should be glad if you would ring for an express messenger, for I have a letter to send, and it is important that it should go out at once. Holmes spent the evening in rummaging among the files of the old daily newspaper with which one of our lumber rooms was packed. When at last he descended, it was with triumph in his eyes, but he had said nothing to either of us as to the result of his researches. For my own part, I had followed step by step the methods by which he had traced the various windings of its complex case, and, though I could not yet perceive the goal which we could reach, I understood clearly that Holmes expected this grotesque criminal to make an attempt upon the 2 remaining busts, one of which I remembered was at Chiswick. No doubt the object of our journey was to catch him in the very act, and I could not but admire the cunning with which my friend had inserted a wrong clue in the evening paper so as to give the fellow the idea that he could continue his scheme with impunity. I was not surprised when Holmes suggested that I should take my revolver with me. He had himself picked up the loaded hunting crop, which was his favorite weapon. A 4-wheeler was at the door at 11, and in it we drove to a spot at the other side of Hammersmith Bridge. Here the cabman was directed to wait. A short walk brought us to a secluded road fringed with pleasant houses, each standing in its own grounds. In the light of a street lamp we read Laburnum Villa upon the gate-post, and of one of them. The occupants had evidently retired to rest, for all was dark save for a fanlight over the hall door, which shed a single blurred circle onto the garden path. The wooden fence, which separated the grounds from the road, threw a dense black shadow upon the inner side, and here it was that we crouched. "I fear that you'll have to wait long," Holmes whispered. "We may thank our stars that it is not raining. I don't think we can even venture to smoke to pass the time. However, it's a 2-to-1 chance that we get something to pay us for our trouble." It proved, however, that our vigil was not to be so long as Holmes had led us to fear, and it ended with a very sudden and singular fashion. In an instant, without the least sound to warn us of his coming, the garden gate swung open, and a lithe, dark figure, as swift and active as an ape, rushed up the garden path. We saw it whisk past the light thrown from over the door, and disappeared against the black shadow of the house. There was a long pause, during which we held our breath, and then a very gentle creaking sound came to our ears. The window was being opened. The noise ceased, and again there was a long silence. The fellow was making his way into the house. We saw the sudden flash of a dark lantern inside the room. What he sought was evidently not there, for again we saw the flash through another blind, and then another. Oh, hang on a second. How did that happen? There we go. "Let us get to the other window. We will nab him as he climbs out," Lestrade whispered. But before we could move, the man had emerged again. As he came out into the glimmering patch of light, we saw that he carried something white under his arm. He looked stealthily all around him. The silence of the deserted street reassured him. Turning his back upon us, he laid down his burden, and then the next instant there was the sound of a sharp tap, followed by a clatter and rattle. The man was so intent upon what he was doing that he never heard our steps as we stole across the grass plot. With the bound of a tiger, Holmes was on his back, and an instant later Lestrade and I had him by either wrist, and the handcuff had been fastened. As we turned him over, I saw a hideous sallow face with writhing furious features glaring up at us, and I knew that it was indeed the man of the photograph whom we had secured. But it was not our prisoner to whom Holmes was giving his attention. Squatted on the doorstep, he was engaged in most careful examination, that which the man had brought from the house. It was a bust of Napoleon, like the one that we had seen that morning, and it had been broken into similar fragments. Carefully, Holmes held each separate shard to the light, but in no way did it differ from any other shattered piece of plaster. He had not completed his examination when the hall lights flew up, the door opened, and the owner of the house, a jovial, rotund figure in shirt and trousers, presented himself. "Mr. Josiah Brown, I suppose?" said Holmes. "Yes, sir, and you, no doubt, are Mr. Sherlock Holmes? I had the note which you sent by the express messenger, and I did exactly what you told me. We locked every door in the inside and waited developments. Well, I am very glad to see that we have got the rascal. I hope, gentlemen, that you will come in and have some refreshment." However, Lestrade was anxious to get his man into safe quarters, so within a few minutes our cab had been summoned, and we were all four upon our way to London. Not a word would our captive say, but he glared at us from the shadow of his matted hair, and once, when my hand seemed within his reach, he snapped at it like a hungry wolf. He stayed long enough at the police station to learn that a search of his clothing revealed nothing save a few shillings and a long sheath knife, the handle of which bore copious traces of recent blood. "That's all right," said Lestrade as we parted. "Hill knows all these gentry, and he will give a name to him. He'll find that my theory of the Mafia will work out all right, but I'm sure I am exceedingly obliged to you, Mr. Holmes, for the workman-like way in which you had laid your hands upon him. I don't quite understand it all yet." "I fear it is rather too late an hour for explanation," said Holmes. "Besides, there are one or two details which are not finished off, and it is one of those cases which are worth working out to the very end. If you will come round once more to my rooms at 6 o'clock tomorrow, I think I shall be able to show you that even now we have not grasped the entire meaning of this business, which presents some features which make it absolutely original in the history of crime. If ever I permit you to chronicle any more of my little problems, Watson, I foresee that you will enliven your pages by an account of the singular adventures of the Napoleon busts. When we met again next evening, Lestrade was furnished with much information concerning our prisoner. His name, it appeared, was Beppo, second name unknown. He was a well-known ne'er-do-well among the Italian colony. He had once been a skilful sculptor, and had earned an honest living, but he had taken to evil courses, and had twice already been in gaol, once for petty theft, and once, as we had already heard, from stabbing a fellow countryman. He could talk enough English pretty well. His reasons for destroying the busts were still unknown, and he refused to answer any questions upon the subject. But the police had discovered that these same busts might very well have been made by his own hands, since he was engaged in his class of work at the establishment of Gelder and Company. To all this information, much of which we already knew, Holmes listened with polite attention, but I, who knew him so well, could clearly see that his thoughts were elsewhere, and I detected a mixture of mingled uneasiness and expectation between that mask which he was wont to assume. At last he started in his chair, and his eyes brightened. There had been a ring at the bell. A minute later we heard steps upon the stairs, and an elderly, red-faced man with grizzled side whiskers was ushered in. In his right hand he carried an old-fashioned carpet-bag, which he placed upon the table. "Is Mr. Sherlock Holmes here?" My friend bowed and smiled. "Mr. Sandford of Reading, I suppose," said he. "Yes, sir, I hear that I'm a little late, but the trains were awkward. You wrote to me about a bust that is in my possession." "Exactly. I have your letter here. You said, 'I desire to possess a copy of Devon's Napoleon, and am prepared to pay you £10 for the one which is in your possession.' Is that right?" "Certainly." "I was very much surprised at your letter, for I could not imagine how you knew that I owned such a thing." "Of course you must have been surprised, but the explanation is very simple. Mr. Harding, of Harding Brothers, said that they had sold you their last copy, and he gave me your address." "Oh, what was it? What? Oh, goodness, sorry. Oh, that was it, was it? Did he tell you what I paid for it?" "No, he did not." "Well, I am an honest man, though not a very rich one. I only gave him 5 shillings for the bust, and I think you ought to know that before I take £10 from you." "I am sure the scruple does your honor, Mr. Sandford, but I have named the price, so I intend to stick to it." "Well, it is very handsome of you, Mr. Holmes. I brought the bust up with me, as you asked me to do. Here it is." He opened his bag, and at last we saw placed upon our table a complete specimen of that bust, which we had already seen more than once in fragments. Holmes took a paper from his pocket, and laid a £10 note upon the table. "You will kindly sign that paper, Mr. Sandford, in the presence of these witnesses. It is simply to say that you transfer every possible right that you have had in the bust to me. I am a methodical man, you see, and you never know what turn of events might take afterwards. Thank you, Mr. Sandford. Here is your money, and I wish you a very good evening." When our visitor had disappeared, Sherlock Holmes' movements were such as to rivet our attention. He began by taking a clean white cloth from a drawer and laying it over the table. Then he placed his newly acquired bust in the center of the cloth. Finally, he picked up his hunting crop and struck Napoleon a sharp blow on the top of the head. The figure broke into fragments, and Holmes bent eagerly over the shattered remains. Next instant, with a loud shout of triumph, he held up one splinter, in which a round, dark object was fixed, like a plum in a pudding. "Gentlemen," he cried, "let me introduce you to the famous Black Pearl of the Borgias." Lestrade and I sat silent for a moment, and then, With a spontaneous impulse, we both broke into clapping, as at the well-wrought crisis of a play. A flush of color sprang to Holmes' pale cheeks, and he bowed to us like the master dramatist who receives the homage of his audience. It was at such moments that for an instant he ceased to be a reasoning machine, and betrayed his human love of admiration and applause. The same singular, proud, and reserved nature which turned away with disdain from popular notoriety was capable of being moved to its depths by spontaneous wonder and praise from a friend. "Yes, gentlemen," said he, "it is the most famous pearl now existing in the world, and it has been my good fortune, by a connected chain of inductive reasoning, to trace it from the Prince of Colonna's bedroom at the Darcy Hotel, where it was lost, to the interior of this, the last of the 6 busts of Napoleon, which were manufactured by Gelder and Company, of Stepney. You will remember, Lestrade, the sensation caused by the disappearance of this valuable jewel, and the vain attempts of the London police to recover it. I was myself consulted upon the case, but I was unable to throw any light upon it. Suspicion fell upon the maid of the princess, who was an Italian, and it was proved that she had a brother in London, but we failed to trace any connection between them. The maid's name was Lucretia Venici, and there is no doubt in my mind that this Pietro, who was murdered 2 nights ago, was the brother. I've been looking up the dates in the old files of paper, and I find that the disappearance of the pearl was exactly 2 days before the arrest of Beppo for some crime of violence, an event which took place in the factory of Gelder and Company, at the very moment when these busts were being made. Now you clearly see the sequence of events, though you see them, of course, in the inverse order to the way in which they were presented themselves to me. Beppo had the pearl in his possession. He may have stolen it from Pietro. He may have been Pietro's confederate. He may have been the go-between of Pietro and his sister. It is of no consequence to us which is the correct solution. The main fact is that he had the pearl, and at that moment when it was on his person, he was pursued by the police. He made for the factory in which he worked, and he knew that he had only a few minutes in which to conceal this enormously valuable prize, which would otherwise be found on him when he had searched. 6 plaster casts of Napoleon were drying in the passage. One of them was still soft. In an instant, Beppo, a skilful workman, made a small hole in the wet plaster, dropped in the pearl, and with a few touches covered over the aperture once more. It is an admirable hiding-place. No one could possibly find it. But Beppo was condemned to a year's imprisonment, and in the meanwhile his 6 busts were scattered over London. He could not tell which contained his treasure. Only by breaking them open could he see. Even shaking would tell him nothing, for as the plaster was wet, it was probable that the pearl would adhere to it, as in fact it has done. Beppo did not despair, and he conducted his search with considerable ingenuity and perseverance. Through a cousin who works with Gelder, he found out the retail firms who had bought the busts. He managed to find employment with Morse Hudson, and in that way we tracked down 3 of them. The pearl was not there. Then, with the help of some Italian employee, he succeeded in finding out where the other 3 busts had gone. The first was at Harker's. There he was dogged by his confederate, who held Beppo responsible for the loss of the pearl, and he stabbed him in the scuffle which followed. If he had his confederate, why should he carry his photograph? I asked, as a means of tracing him if he wished to inquire about him from a third person. That was the obvious reason. Well, after the murder, I calculated that Beppo would probably hurry rather than delay his movements. He would fear that the police would read his secret, and so he hastened on before they could get behind him. Of course, I could not say that he had not found the pearl in Harker's bust. I had not even concluded for certain that it was the pearl, but it was evident to me that he was looking for something, since he carried the bust past the other houses in order to break it in the garden which had a lamp overlooking it. Since Harker's bust was one of the three, the chances were exactly as I told you, 2 to 1 against the pearl being inside it. There remains 2 busts, and it was obvious that he would go for the London one first. I warned the inmates of the house as to avoid a second tragedy, and we went down with the happiest results. By the time, of course, I knew for certain that it was the Borgia pearl that we were after. The name of the murderer man linked the one event with the other. There only remained a single bust, the Reading one, and the pearl must be there. I bought it in your presence from the owner, and there it lies." We sat in silence for a moment. "Well," said Lestrade, "I've seen you handle a good many cases, Mr. Holmes, but I don't know that I ever knew a more workmanlike one than that. We're not jealous of you at Scotland Yard. No, sir, we are very proud of you, and if you come down tomorrow, there's not a man from the oldest inspector to the youngest constable who wouldn't be glad to shake you by the hand." "Thank you," said Holmes. "Thank you." And as he turned away, it seemed to me that he was more nearly moved by the softer human emotion than I had ever seen him. A moment later he was the cold and practical thinker once more. "Put the pearl in the safe, Watson," said he, "and get out the papers of the Conk-Singleton forgery case. Goodbye, Lestrade. If any little problem comes your way, I'll be happy if I can to give you a hint or two as to its solution." And we have reached the end of our second adventure of the story time. So we're going to go ahead and end the stream here. I don't know if I'll be doing a stream I will most likely be doing a stream on Thursday. I'm not sure of when, and if it will be a story time, if it will be an art stream, or if it will be a gaming stream. I will let you know as soon as I know what is happening on Thursday. But on Tuesday, same time as before, we're going to be starting 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And I'm not sure if I'll have any artwork to post up on the stream then. It may be that I'll put some little placeholder there and then do something as we read along. Let's see, as for your question, Kicken, before I actually started playing, I had tried to write out a backstory for my characters, but the character didn't seem to come naturally. So when I created a character on the spot, just choosing all the particulars, as I was getting to know the character as I played them, then the backstory sort of started to grow in my mind. And I haven't really sat down and written a backstory yet, but I've definitely had them, compose themselves in my mind to come out in little hints and all that stuff. Anyways, we're going to go ahead and end the stream here. I will probably next be streaming on Monday night, Pacific time, and I will let you know on Discord and Twitter and all of those things. And then, of course, story time on Tuesday, same time as this. And I thank you so much for hanging out with me, for listening, and I hope to see you next time. Hope you have a good day or night or time zone, whatever. Bye.